Okay.
Blair, you can come back forward also if you're out there.
I'm here, Carol, but I'm going to keep the camera off at least for now to minimize bandwidth use.
Okay, sounds good. Frank, when you're ready, we're ready.
Okay. Get started. Good afternoon. I now call this meeting the School Board of Palm Beach County to order at 3:05 p.m. on May 20, 2020. Today, the board will participate in virtual board workshops in our virtual regular board meeting. We will start with the workshop, and then immediately following will be our regular board meeting. These meetings will be conducted using Google Meet technology for board members and staff who are participating live. Viewers and listeners can access this meeting by watching on Comcast channel 235 or by using the YouTube link on our webpage at palmbeachschools.org. We also offer a listening-only option by calling 561-357-5900 or toll-free at 1-866-930-7015. The meeting ID is 156-188-01-124 with a hash mark at the end. Mrs. Bass, will you please call the roll? Board members, please verbalize your response instead of just raising your hand so it can be captured in the recording.
District 1, Barbara McQuinn. Here. District 2, Chuck Shaw.
Here.
District 3, Karen Brell.
Here.
District 4, Erica Whitfield.
Here.
District 5, Frank Barbieri.
Here.
District 6, Marcia Andrews.
Here.
District 7, Deborah Robinson.
Here.
Good. We have all 7 board members present for quorum purposes. Also joining us on our virtual dais is Superintendent Dr. Donald Fenoy, Assistant General Counsel Blair Littlejohn, Inspector General Lung Chu, Board Clerk Carol Bass, and in his last meeting today, soon to be graduating senior and our Palm Beach County Council of Student Council's President, Jaden Manuel. Senior staff members will join us periodically as directed by the superintendent. This meeting is being transcribed by a closed captioner, so please remember to speak at a reasonable pace. Now, please direct your attention to the flag on the screen. Dr. Fenoy, will you lead us in the pledge? And please, everyone else, keep your microphones muted while we say the pledge.
Yes, sir. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Dr. Fenoy. Before I turn the workshop over to Dr. Fenoy, I wanted to review our meeting protocol. When you want to be recognized, please raise your hand to get my attention, and I will nod to acknowledge that I saw you want to speak. I will recognize you in the order that I see your hands. Please try to remember to keep your microphones muted if you're not speaking to eliminate audio feedback. If you need to step away from your computers for a moment, please turn off your camera. This will let me know that you've stepped away, although I know you can still hear what is happening in the meeting. Dr. Fenoy, it's all yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this time, I'll turn over our first workshop for the day, which is on the budget, to our Chief Finance Officer, Mr. Mike Berg.
Good afternoon. It's great to see you all again. I am going to share my screen. We've got a full presentation for you today. I feel like we have a lot of ground to cover. We'll try to move through it fairly quickly and save plenty of time for questions and answers. Hopefully now you're seeing the presentation. I'll jump right in. There was an outline provided, but basically the plan is I'd like to start at the national level and try to explain how this COVID-19 induced global recession is going to impact the state of Florida and then potentially then our school district. And I'm just going to jump right in. You've probably all seen this in the news, but the unemployment numbers are staggering. April's report had 14.7% of the U.S. unemployed. That's 20.5 million jobs lost. And prior to this outbreak, this virus, we had some of the lowest unemployment rates in history. So what's incredible is that we have lost all of the jobs created over the past 10 years. And when you look at the speed that this recession is moving at, going back to the Great Recession, it took 2 years to lose 9 million jobs. So we've lost double that many jobs in a couple months, which is just really unprecedented. And this unemployment, if this is not remedied soon, it's going to have pretty dire consequences on the economy. It's going to create more demand for Medicaid, unemployment. It could bleed over into the housing market and really have some long-term consequences. So, trying to get a read on Florida's budget situation and what may happen to our own budget, you're hearing from our state leaders that they really don't know yet. There's some optimism that maybe they can tap into state reserves and that the federal stimulus dollars may be enough that they could avoid a special session. The governor's been clear that the current budget we're in, FY20, that will end June 30th, should be untouched and will be in good shape. What's not known is if there'll be a special session needed to come back and readdress the FY21 budget that was approved by the legislature on March 19th. So what we've done here is trying to do our own assessment. After the Great Recession, the credit rating agency Moody's, which is pretty well regarded, they started doing an annual assessment of what they called state stress testing. And that was a report designed to try to figure out and gauge each state's capacity to withstand the next recession. We always knew there'd be some type of recession. We figured it'd be a more moderate type of event, but this has surprised everyone. So in April, Moody's updated their annual report to basically include 2 new scenarios that are more severe. And they did 2 stress tests. They did a baseline scenario, which would basically assume that we are in a deep recession for the first half of 2020. And then we start to see a modest rebound and you start seeing travel and business restrictions lift late in the second quarter. And then the more severe scenario, S3, assumes basically you go one more quarter of a deep recession and you start to see those travel and businesses getting back to normal late in the third quarter. The report also found that when you look at states, they need to get through either scenario, they need to have about 18 to 23% of their budget held in reserve if they hope to get through this recession without having to either raise taxes or make budget cuts. And the results from state to state vary significantly. Moody's did find that compared to the last Great Recession, states were better prepared. In some cases, they found like 17 states could probably get through the baseline scenario. Unfortunately, Florida is not one of those states. We are actually one of the states of greatest concern. And you see the map there with Florida in red. The states in red are states that are expected to have more than a 10% budget shortfall based on a moderate level recession, or the baseline recession. For Florida, the baseline recession would leave us with about 13% state budget shortfall, and then it could be as much as 18% in the more severe scenario. This report was based on 2019 data. So I do need to point out, so when Moody's did this report, they were looking at about $3.6 billion in the state's rainy day fund. And then with other balances that brought other budget balances, they figured Florida had about 10.8%. Our state leaders have been clear as of late that they've increased the reserves to some extent. They're up to about $4.5 billion in reserves now. And they added $300 million as part of that budget they approved for FY21 on March 19th, specifically for COVID. So the challenge will be, how devastated are the revenues and how far will this money go? And then the other thing, the state is likely going to have to dip into their reserves just to get through FY20. We've seen some preliminary March reports on sales tax revenue that were down 25% or $770 million just for 1 month. And that was March. April, we were only shut down partially for the month of March. April will be a complete month of shutdown, and those numbers are expected to be worse. So that just gives you some context of what the state's dealing with. One of the big issues I know the governor's going to be waiting on guidance from is with the federal stimulus dollars they've received. Right now, there's very limited flexibility. The the state is looking for the ability to use that stimulus money to just replace lost revenue. And so far, Congress has not approved that. They want the money spent like specifically on COVID recovery. So there are some unknowns that we're still kind of struggling with to figure this out. The next thing you kind of have to look at is say, okay, well, how does education fit into the state budget? The state's got over a $90 billion budget. But what you really need to draw your attention to is what they call their general revenue budget, which is similar to our general fund. That runs about $33.7 billion. And we provide a little chart of what makes up the state general revenue. You can see 77% of that's from sales tax. And then we also added, I know people are understanding, tourism's come to a screeching halt. Tourism across the whole state represents about 13% of the sales tax. And that varies from county to county. Orlando is, I've heard, as high as 40% is tourism for their sales tax. But this just gives you an idea about how the sales tax comes in across businesses and households. The next step is then to dig a little deeper and say, okay, of that state general revenue, how much goes to education, which is $26 million. And then more specifically, how much goes to K-12 education? And in our state, keep in mind, we do not have a state income tax. We're one of 7 states without it. K-12 education in Florida is supported almost entirely through state general revenue and local property taxes. The state general revenue is about 57% of our funding to operate our schools. And that's what the immediate concern is. We expect the local property taxes for FY21 will be based on home values as of January 1st, this past January 1st. So this first year of the recession, we should see our local property taxes stay pretty stable. There could be some collection issues, but hopefully we'll be in pretty good shape with the local taxes. Really more concerned about what's going to happen with the state revenue and how that's going to trickle down to our school district. But just want to make the point, we are heavily dependent on sales tax. So I do expect, a negative impact. And the size of that impact is the great question. Ms. Knust and I have gone back and tried to kind of revisit the Great Recession and look at kind of some key indicators that played out over that period, and then try to draw some assumptions from that to predict what may happen next year. And I thought this was an excellent chart Ms. Knust came up with, but it shows you, so back to 2007, when we had a very dramatic drop in state general revenue. And the blue line is general revenue, the red line is state sales tax. You can see the very tight correlation because they're almost one and the same. The purple line is Florida's unemployment. And, we had unemployment shot up to about 11% at the height of the Great Recession. We're going to shoot well past that, at least on the short term. And then the national gross domestic product, which is just a commonly used key indicator of the overall economy. And that's expected, that is plummeting right now as well. And we use this model, you're going to see more on this later. We've done 5 budget scenarios because we have this kind of such a level of uncertainty that we could not just give the board really one scenario and say, this is what we think is going to happen. You're going to have to kind of work with us here, and we're going to have to be a little fluid and kind of adapt as we get more information. But this is kind of the basis for the scenarios we'll get more into. Just another way to look at it is, this is state general revenue again, and this is the either loss or gain in recurring general revenue from year to year. And so if you go back to the Great Recession, in that first year, the state lost $351 million. Now, I just mentioned earlier that in the month of March, the state lost and reported $770 million in 1 month. So that's obviously cause for great concern. In FY9, we lost about 1.6 billion. At the height of the recession in FY10, the state was down about 4 billion in revenue. Then we've you see what's transpired, as we slowly recovered from the Great Recession. We've had growth for the last several years. And now looking at FY21, we're showing scenarios where basically the state could be down $3.7 to $7.7 billion. And we hope we've captured the worst of it. We're going to know more that the April sales tax numbers, the final report will be out around June 25th. It's possible preliminary numbers will get leaked earlier, kind of like what happened with the March data. But if I go by the calendar of when this information is typically finalized and available, the state will have the benefit of what happened in knowing what happened to April collections in late June. And that's noteworthy because right now, as I said, no one's committed to a special session. The governor has not even received the budget from the legislature that was approved March 19th. At some point that budget will probably be provided to him, and there's a lot of speculation around, will he sign it, or will he call a special session, or will he try to do it himself and use line item vetoes to go through the budget? It's been reported that there may be 500 million or so that could kind of single member projects that could be line item vetoed. But again, that may not be enough to be comfortable that the state would have a balanced budget for next year. So digging a little more into the scenarios, and we've color coded them here. The green scenario represents the budget that the legislature approved on March 19th for next school year. This would obviously be a great scenario at this point, but it's probably highly unlikely. This was the budget that was going to put a significant amount of money into raising our teacher salaries. It's going to provide $500 million across the state to raise that starting salary as close as we could get to 47.5, and provide some modest increases. So if that budget held true, we'd be in good shape. We wouldn't even be talking about budget cuts. Some of these other scenarios, the yellow scenario is if we had our funding rolled back basically to FY19 levels, like if we basically had a 2-year setback and the state rolled us back, we'd be down about $50 a student. And, that would be manageable as well. I think we could get through that with, we'd be able to manage our way through that probably without any real significant, tough budget cuts. Once you get into scenarios 3 through 5, it becomes much, much more difficult. You can see just a 5% drop in our funding equates to $412 per student, or a loss of $98.2 million. And 5% might be optimistic, at this point. Think in terms, I mentioned that the state, our funding's 57% state, 43% local. If you start hearing, the state's down 10 or 20%, that means our district is probably down about half that amount at least. So the next couple scenarios get a little more dire. We looked at scenario 4. We took like one of the toughest years as a recession, FY10, we were down state revenues down about 16. And that would translate to about $143 million shortfall for us. We'd be down about 8% in our funding. And then scenario 5 is the worst case, of course. Our funding would be down about 12%, and the state would be down about 23%. And that would translate to a $207 million loss in revenue. And Ms. Canusa is going to go into this a little more depth later in the presentation and show you how this is just the impact of FEFP revenue. She's going to show you what that means in terms of our budget more specifically. So I understand there's considerable range in these scenarios, and that's not comforting. I'm troubled by it myself. What I will say with some confidence is that the state budget, as well as myself, are due for a haircut and a shave, and it's only a matter of time till that happens. But all right, you have to have some humor in these dark times. But anyway, maybe not. Did
you keep your hair grown out just to make that joke?
Yes, it's been 8 weeks without a haircut just to get to that one mediocre joke.
I found it very entertaining. I felt you needed some credit.
All right, well, back to the serious stuff here. This chart shows you funding per student in Florida. What I want to point out, so it shows the ride we went through with the Great Recession. I want to draw your attention to the dark blue at the tips of some of these years. That was the federal stimulus money. And during the Great Recession, that was the ERA funds that really helped save a lot of jobs in our county, in our school district. And while the money shows up in only 2 years, you may recall we had some flexibility to carry those funds forward, and we actually helped smooth out that reduction for over 3 or 4 years. And we were able to save a lot of jobs thanks to those ERA dollars. The scenarios now in FY21 are the same ones I mentioned earlier. And what that shows you is the stimulus money that's been approved to date through the CARES Act. And the other thing just to keep in mind is that, since we went through the last recession in 2007, we've grown by 23,000 kids. So when we talk about losing, if we lose $1,000 per student, that's now $23 million more lost revenue than it would have been, 13 years ago. So we're a bigger district, which means we have to, we always look at the total revenue, but if you look at dollars per student, we have to keep in mind we have more students. I want to spend a minute just to talk about the important role of federal stimulus in this type of situation. And really, to date, the amount that's gone to K-12 schools is pretty modest. The graphic to the left of the screen here shows you that the CARES Act package to date is over $2 trillion. And you can see the major components. That includes the $1,200 checks to individuals and small business loans and all that stuff. If you got to go down to almost the bottom of the page to see the thin line there for K-12 schools. So to date, only $13.5 billion has been approved for schools across the nation. Our expected share of that in Palm Beach County is $37.5 million. And we'll be sharing those dollars with our charter schools, our students that are on vouchers through the Family Empowerment Scholarships or the McKay Scholarships, and also with eligible private schools, which is some issue too, because there was some ruling about the private schools eligibility that may broaden that to private schools that normally don't enjoy any federal entitlement funds because they don't have the free and reduced lunch students that normally it takes to qualify for that funding. So that's a whole other issue. I know Ms. Andrews has been following that closely with the Council of Great State Schools. We're not sure. We're waiting right now. The state has not opened up the applications for school districts to apply for our share of this money. At some point that'll happen, and we'll have more details about how this money is going to flow and how we can use it to help with our budget challenges. What I want to mention is, there is conversation. The House, I'll jump ahead, but just to give you some context, the era, that was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act back during the Great Recession through President Obama's administration, just how much that did for us. That was $100 billion for education, with the bulk of it going, 84% going to K-12 education. Our district received almost $204 million through the ERA program. And again, it was a lifeblood that really carried us through the darkest fiscal times we ever had. In comparison, the CARES Act is less than a third of that, at $30.9 billion, and K-12 schools are getting a smaller share, they're only getting 54%. And like I mentioned, our share of that potentially is $37 million, which sounds like a lot of money, but with the magnitude of the crisis we're in, this will not go far enough. So I know you're all following the legislation. There was, the House last week approved the HEROES Act, which would be another $3 trillion in stimulus. The Senate does not seem anxious to embrace the House's HEROES Act, and they've said there'll probably be no discussion until after Memorial Day at the earliest. But we've seen some posturing already that it may not be well received. And in the best case scenario, if the HEROES Act was supported, it includes about $60 billion more for K-12 schools. So that's $60 billion, which plus what was previously approved would still be short of the ERA program, but obviously $60 billion would be very, very welcomed, and I think it's going to be needed. That HEROES Act has got more funding for state and local governments, and including school districts, and it looks like it's going to be a pretty contentious item for our Congress to navigate, but it's something I know Ms. Solnit and our legislative team is paying close attention, and we're going to have to really watch that closely and hope we get some more help. So with that, I would like to turn it over to our budget director, Ms. Heather Knust. She's done a lot of hard work to help us prepare for this crisis. And Heather, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you. So we're going to get into each of a more detailed level of review of each of the scenarios. And starting with the green scenario, we're not going to spend much time on that because it really is truly highly unlikely. That's the scenario that the FEFP that was currently approved by both the House and Senate, but hasn't yet been signed by the governor.
Heather,
So moving on.
let me see if any board members want to ask Mike before you go on.
Sure.
Any board members want to ask any questions of Mr. Burke? I just have a question, Heather, maybe you're going to cover this, but Mike, in those scenarios that you have there, the dire ones, have you factored in the cost for us to put in place social distancing mandates that might come down from the state, classroom cleaning, and how we're going to get kids to school on buses with, less kids on a bus, so there are more trips? Has any of that been factored in, or is this just business as usual, what it would look like without all that extra stuff that might have to do?
We are working on all of that. This is business as usual. We're going to close out this presentation with a slide about our challenges going forward, and the cost of the safety measures and health precautions and all that is a big part of that. So no, we do not have any hard numbers for you today. We're working out what those models are going to look like for the fall, and I just not ready yet really to share those numbers, but it's going to be a significant cost. It's also going to be, we may get some federal help with that. There's one other piece of stimulus money I didn't mention. It's a much smaller bucket that the governor has available that could be used for some of those things related directly to kind of new costs associated with COVID-19. It could be anything from devices to, hand sanitizer. The one I do want to mention about transportation, though, because I'm involved with the state council and also the Council of Great City Schools on a national basis. And if you think about the challenge we have with just having enough bus drivers and buses to meet transportation on a good day, if there is probably no schedule creative enough that's going to allow us to cut the capacity in half. And, if we have to spread the kids out with 6 feet of separation on a school bus, it's going to be very, what my colleagues are saying is basically it's impossible, but we've got to go through the exercise. But transportation is a major concern in this because, the buses, how the seats on a bus work. And if you lose all that capacity, we leverage our buses to make all 3 runs, elementary, middle, and high schools. So the scheduling, I just don't even know if it's possible to expect a bus would get by on half capacity or not. We have to run those scenarios, but that's one really to keep an eye on.
All right, thank you.
All right, so getting into the yellow scenario, which is really the best of the worst case scenarios, that's if our funding were to roll back to FY19 per student funding. We'd have a loss of $28 million. We're factoring in the stimulus, which we know we're going to receive $37.5 million. We haven't received the application from the state yet, but we do know the amount of money that we're receiving. So once you add in the federal stimulus, that would pretty much put us at a break even as to where we are operating right now in FY20, a slight increase of $9 million. That's until we go through and walk through the revenue adjustments. We still have to pass through funding to charter schools, McKay, family empowerment scholarships. We also have to share the portion of the federal stimulus with charter schools as well as private schools. So that $37.5 million in federal stimulus really is going to equate to about $30 million for district operated schools. We also have to adjust revenue because we expect that we're going to have, and we've already seen, a decrease in our interest revenue. And because of the unemployment, we expect that we're not going to see over collection of taxes like we have in the past. So then not only looking at the adjustments in revenue, that's then compounded by the state mandates. And the increase in the FRS has already been approved by the governor, but the other increases in FEFP, like in mental health and the teacher compensation, those have yet to be signed. But since that has been approved by both the House and Senate, those are reflected as state mandates. And at this point, we're assuming that they will be included in next year's budget. And if they are, that $9 million increase evaporates into a $55 million shortfall just for Palm Beach County district operated schools. Moving on up to the red scenario, which is, we hope, the worst case scenario, that then equates to a nearly $210 million shortfall in Palm Beach County. So next slide. The board set budget priorities back in December 2019, and those board priorities or budget priorities still relate with some changes. So we want to make sure to prioritize our current workforce. We need to make sure to monitor, which we are, federal and state and local regulations. Oftentimes in economic crises like these, the state and federal government is willing to waive and create some flexibilities within the regulations to help us utilize those funds to help mitigate any revenue shortfalls that they know that we're going to impact or that we're going to be faced for the upcoming year. And then also we need to make sure that even though this is an emergency and we've set aside contingency funds to help deal with emergencies, we have to make sure that we still maintain reserves for any potential future uncertainties that we're going to face, which I'll get into more detail. But we weren't expecting to have a pandemic. We never planned that these funds would be set aside for a pandemic, but we're already entering in hurricane season, and we already see that there's the first named storm has already been named. So next slide. We are planning for reductions. They are significant shortfalls that we're facing, between $55 million to over $200 million. And when we're facing shortfalls of that magnitude, we have to make sure that we take a balanced approach to these reductions. So we're going to continue the hiring and spending freeze that was implemented in March 23rd through the remainder of this year, as well as into FY21. We're already working on reviewing department budgets. You know, our focus and our goal is to minimize the impact to students. Next slide. In order to put those shortfalls and the potential reductions we're facing into context, our general fund budget is $2.1 billion. And looking at that red scenario, scenario 5, $210 million represents 10% of our district budget. That's why when we're looking at reductions, we have to make sure that we are really taking a balanced approach. We can't just take from just one area within the budget. Next slide. We often talk about, at least every year, fund balance. So I wanted to walk through and explain the different components of fund balance. In FY20, we are projecting to have an increase. And the reason we're projecting to have an increase is because of the shutdown of schools in mid-March, as well as the hiring and spending freeze that was implemented on March 23rd. So based on the savings that we're going to generate from the shutdown, as well as the hiring and spending freeze, those monies are going to increase fund balance and, you know, potentially to be able to use in future years. The purple part of the bar is unassigned. That's the board contingency that is mandated in board policy, the minimum of 3% that's set aside. The green part of fund balance is assigned. Those are funds that are set aside for a specific purpose, like purchase orders or after-school funds that are carried over from year to year for the schools to utilize for those programs. The red part of fund balance is restricted. That's set aside for by Florida statute. Those are for things like categoricals, advanced placement, workforce, adult ed funds that we have to set aside by statute for a specific purpose. And then that small sliver on the bottom is non-spendable. Those are funds that are already spent but haven't been used yet. So that's like our diesel fuel inventory. So the money's already out the door, but we'll recognize it as expense once we finally use it. So next slide. And looking and going back to that purple piece, the board contingency, that purpose of the board contingency is to meet unexpected and emergency needs. You often hear it called the rainy day fund. And I think we can all agree that this qualifies as a rainy day. But we still have to be very strategic in how we utilize those funds, because we don't know how long this economic crisis is truly going to last. It could last up to 3 years. And once we dip in and we use those contingency funds, they're one-time funds. They're gone, they're spent, and they won't be available for future years. And in addition, like what I mentioned, we have to be prepared for other emergency needs, like hurricane season, which is fast approaching. Next slide. So we are very fortunate in Palm Beach County that the voters approved the 1 mil referendum in November 2018. And the 1 mil referendum, next slide, is based on property tax values. We do not expect property values to be significantly impacted, at least in FY21. And the referendum funds is approximately $200 million. It funds our teacher supplements, elementary art, music, and PE teachers, mental health, as well as additional school security. Next slide. This is a historical look of property values, and if you go back to 2001 too, that was the first recession, or not first recession, but the first recession on going back for purposes of review for this chart. And property values, you can see, were not really impacted during that recession. You fast forward to fiscal year 2008 through 2010, that was the Great Recession, and property values were significantly impacted during the Great Recession. But the fundamentals of the Great Recession are very different than the fundamentals of this and the cause of this economic crisis. And so we do anticipate, like I said, that FY21, that the property values will remain relatively consistent and steady. We may have some issues with property tax collections, but we do expect to at least be at where we are now with our property taxes. But we can't say that necessarily yet for FY22 because it does depend on how severe, how sustained this economic crisis is. Next slide. The local governmental infrastructure surtax, which is approved by the voters in November 2016, is different than the 1 mil referendum because it is based on sales tax and it will be impacted by this crisis. And so the original forecast was almost $1.4 billion. And at least with the sales tax, it is going to take place over a 10-year period. So we had been over-collecting sales tax compared to what our original forecast was. So if we do see a decline in sales tax, we could potentially have a shortfall by the end of the program of about $35 million. But depending on how well the economy rebounds, it is possible that we will be able to make up that shortfall and potentially, even see a little bit more than what our original forecast was. But we will have to continue to monitor. This goes out to 2026. Next slide. There is an impact to other funds as well. So we have our food service program. Our food service program has continued to operate the community feeding program. We have been able to submit for reimbursement still through the federal government, but those reimbursements do not cover the cost to actually continue to operate the food service program. So as a result, we are looking at a projected loss of between $8 to $10 million. We are continuing to look for other resources in order to minimize that loss as much as possible, but we are projecting to have a loss within the food service program. They currently do have a sufficient fund balance to cover this loss, but we have to make sure that, that we are continuing to reduce it as much as we can. In addition to the food service program, we do have other grants as well. We are continuing to monitor for any guidance and any changes in any of the regulations of our federal, state, or local funds. Next slide. So our next Budget Advisory Committee is on June 4th. We had to cancel our last Budget Advisory Committee on March 19th because that was right after we had gone through to shut down schools. So at that next Budget Advisory Committee, we will be going into more detail on the different reductions. I want to point out that the state has not changed any of the budget adoption deadlines and dates. So tentative adoption is scheduled for July 29th, and final budget adoption is scheduled still for September 9th. Next slide. And so we are, and this goes to what Mr. Barbieri had mentioned earlier, the way that we operate will fundamentally change for next year in FY21. And as we navigate those changes will have an impact on next year's budget. And so, for example, working towards one-to-one devices, the enhanced cleaning. And I'm sure there's other items that are not even, considered on this slide as of right now. So those changes will have to be incorporated and will have an impact on next year's budget in FY21. So with that, I would like to open it up for questions.
Mr. Shaw?
Thank you. Heather, in the event that we were to see not knowing how many, but if we saw a number of students who decided not to come back to regular school classroom offerings in the fall, and they chose to do virtual education, how, if there's a difference, how is FTE calculated for those students? And if we were to see a big increase in students doing Florida virtual type instruction, what would the impact be on that?
So there.
I'll take a shot at it, Heather, and then you can help me out. Mr. Shaw, we're looking at kind of three models basically. We feel like there'll still be some probably traditional classroom instruction, which we know what the FTE revenue is for that. There's complete virtual like we have now through Palm Beach Virtual, where the revenue does suffer. But there's also a blended model, I think, where there's an opportunity where we could retain the traditional FEFP revenue and still have this blended delivery model. So that would be what we try to be looking at, to where there's different options for families, and that blended model we try to structure so that we don't lose any of our FTE revenue.
And if you don't mind, Mike, Mr. Shaw, and for the rest of the board, as soon as this started, Mike and I had the conversation around how do we keep kids in our FTE count. And so Keith and Glenda are all now working on this blended model. We don't have all the details now, but it is part of our work group plan to try to keep as many kids in our FTE roles and still provide families the option to stay at home and be educated if necessary. So we're working through those details. We will have workshops beginning in June talking about our current thinking and our progress towards those goals.
All right, and then the second part is simply, what does the impact of dual enrollment have on FTE, and how does that look in the future?
So a few years back, you may recall that the state kind of, they did what they called recalibration, and they limited us to 1 FTE per student. It used to be a kid could take additional classes for dual enrollment and generate additional FTE. And then we also got hit with where the state colleges and universities used to pay for dual enrollment. Now the district must pay for it. So dual enrollment costs us money, and the kids have those options available to them, but it comes at a cost to the school district. So, it's almost somewhat out of our control, because the kids have these choices, and we kind of get the bill for it after the fact. And it's a shame that they did the recalibration at FTE, because that took away our potential revenue stream to help offset that cost. I will, on a more positive note, I would just say that I was happy to see we had a team at the district work to do. Normally this type of year, schools will be doing their kindergarten roundup to make sure we got 13,000 kindergartners we want to see back in school or start their school career with us next fall. And we've gotten to a virtual roundup, working with the communications department and Keith and his team and our FTE department. So parents are able to kind of go online and do like a pre-registration. And we've had, I think, about 3,500 students sign up so far. I think, this is an opportunity for us that it's going to be challenging times for everybody, whether you're in a charter school or private school or district school. But if the better job we can do with this, and I think we have kind of shown we're doing a pretty good job, that I think there's an opportunity maybe to bring some students into the district, hopefully. With unemployment where it is, some families may have to think twice about private school. And we also have in Palm Beach County, you got about 6,000 families that have been in home education prior to the pandemic. Now that they see these options that may be available to them through the district, they might be able to, get virtual education through the district and still keep your child home if that's their preference. So that's what we need to be working on now. We want to try to keep our enrollment up, because if we have a dip in enrollment, that just really compounds our budget problems and kind of pours gas on a fire. We don't want to be dealing with declining enrollment at the same time we're dealing with state budget shortfalls.
Ms. Brill?
Thank you. So not a question, but a comment. And actually you hit exactly, Mr. Shaw, what I had written in my scribbled notes was that much of our budget is based on enrollment. And I do know that a complete virtual model would be incredibly difficult for our career programs, as well as there is a lot of inequity in our different communities. But parents in my area are really interested in the blended model, and they brought something up to me that I'm just sharing, and that is that when they do return to the brick and mortar schools, if a child's out ill, they thought what a fabulous opportunity to keep up with their coursework through the virtual model. So I'm really hoping that we see more interest in the blended model where it's possible. And I know we'll be talking a little bit about the summer virtual learning. I do have a question and a concern, but I appreciate us talking about that as soon as we can.
Mr. Burke, I've got two questions. Does the hiring freeze we currently have in place include not hiring teachers every year? As you know, we hire over 1,000 teachers to replace vacancies. Are we not looking at hiring any teachers? Is the freeze include those also? That's the first part of my question.
At this point, the freeze includes everybody. It's a complete freeze across the board at this point in the process till we have more information to go on. We may have to, at some point, roll back that freeze, maybe for select schools that have a hard time staffing, or maybe in unique specialties where we have critical shortages. But at this point, the complete freeze is basically the best thing we can do to try to protect our current workforce. There's probably, as we work through department budget reorganizations and potential reductions, that may generate people that could go back to the classroom and fill vacancies. And so the dust needs to settle a little bit more before we could probably, before I would recommend that we lift the freeze. I'm conscious of the timeline. You know, we're working towards school. School will be opening on August 10th, so we don't have a lot of time here. But I think we do need to take a little more time. I'm not sure if it's weeks or months, but to make some headway on kind of restructuring things for next year and then determining where we really need to go ahead and hire people from the outside. We don't want to hire anybody from the outside to turn around and not have a job for them in the fall.
I understand, but what is Broward and Martin County doing? Because if we are, we always have the difficult task of finding qualified new teachers, and if they're sucking them all up in the next month or two, then when we finally do start hiring, there may be nobody left for us, especially for some of our hardest to staff schools. So what are they doing? Are they also freezing?
So I can speak to Broward and Dade because I'm meeting with them weekly. They are also in a complete hiring freeze. I'll have to check on Martin for you, but Broward and Dade are also holding up on hiring, and that is something that's part of the equation. You're absolutely right. We don't want to be the last ones to lift it. But right now, everyone's kind of in the same boat, and there is a hard freeze in Dade and Broward as well.
Okay, and with respect to our construction and our maintenance costs, I know we had a lot of bids out there. Are we looking at rebidding any of that stuff in light of the economy shutdown? There must be a much less demand, because that's what we were told before, that the prices were escalating because there was so much demand. I would think that in the private sector, a lot of business people have held off on improving their properties. Are we looking at any savings there? And if we have bids that are outstanding that we can still go back and rebid, are we looking at doing any of that?
Well, we hope to experience that. And that was one of my thoughts too, that because we've been dealing with rising construction costs, the last couple of years, and it's been a challenge for us. So we were thinking this downturn may, bring those prices back in line. It has not happened yet. And one of the challenges, a byproduct of this COVID-19 pandemic, is that some of the building materials and supplies have challenges in the supply chain that's actually causing some of those materials to go up in price. So, Ms. Paul would be the better expert on this subject. But what I've been told so far is that the prices really haven't come down yet. But I think it's logical to expect that will happen at some point, and hopefully we'll benefit from that over the remainder of our kind of construction program here with the sales tax through 2026.
Thank you. Any board members have any other questions? Dr. Robinson?
Thank you. Well, I'm over here somewhere between depressed and despondent because I really remember the tough choices of that recession more than a decade ago. I'm really not looking forward to this. I know, we have to make sure that we do everything to keep children safe and healthy while they're inside of brick and mortar schools. But we also, after safety is concerned, when we start talking about restructuring the educational program and what opportunities available for children, I'm going to ask that we focus on the needs of the children, that we start there, and that we keep equity in mind, because it can't be a one size fits all. It cannot be a just slash everybody 15% or whatever the magic number is going to be. We have to keep the needs of children in the forefront as we go through this activity. I'm thrilled actually to see one-to-one devices on the slide. So I take it that we now agree that that's a goal. I hope that we outline a plan that I understand might be tweaked over time, but that we outline a plan to get there. And finally, I just want to throw in, even though it's a bit off topic, but as we look at the future, the new normal, as they say, whether or not a 4-day school week will be appropriate when we reopen. And that's it for now. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions from the board? Mrs. Andrews, your mic's on. Do you have a question?
Yes, thank you. And Mr. Burke, thank you for your leadership on the financial front at the national level, as well as right here in Palm Beach County. So I really do appreciate the charts, because as we look at how we are right now, we don't know where we're going with the state, the federal government. We're still in a limbo as to what's going to happen with us. So do we have some potential holdbacks? I know that we have a hiring hold right now. We're looking at some of the departments' cutbacks. Are we going to have a way as a board to see the potential issues as relate to maybe not getting the money that we think we're going to get from the state? The governor hasn't signed anything yet. So do we have a plan of action so that when we're talking about holdbacks or budget cuts, that we're going to have workshops to talk through these things before they actually come to light? And also, all of this piece as we get into the new normal with children doing the distance learning, as well as a blended model, all of these things and pieces we're going to have to put in place, and they all cost money. So how soon will we be able to look at your plans as it relate to all of these pieces? Your broad conversation today is great, that we know where we are, we know what we're going to have to go through, but as we look at the district and how we're going to have to readjust, how soon will we be able to look at these pictures of how you see it so that we can have input?
Yes, excellent question. We have a lot of work to do. We've started that effort, working directly with the superintendent. We've got some work to do with your budget committee. We're going to also have an internal budget committee where we'll have some principal leadership engaged. We've got some ideas. The challenging part of this is, to what level are we proactive and we make some of those hard decisions going into next school year, not knowing how this is going to play out at the state level. If the governor if they do not call a special session and that process draws out, we could be going into next school year still not knowing exactly what our budget is. Now, I suspect potentially maybe when those April sales tax numbers come out, that may prompt a special session, because I think the numbers are going to be so severe that it would be unwise to wait. But what we're going to have to get comfortable as a team here is, I think, I've got some work to do with our team to identify potential cost-saving measures that may include some proactive reductions, either in our departments or even maybe loosening up on our class size a little bit for next school year. But we need to work through those with our principals and our committees, and then come back and have another workshop as soon as we can to give the board some of those alternatives and get comfortable with really, I guess, to what level do we want to maybe end up imposing our own kind of reductions in anticipation of what may be coming further down the road, and to what extent are we comfortable with delaying those actions and maybe potentially having to deal with them mid-year. I really think it's in the best interest of our students to minimize the disruption mid-year. It's much more difficult to reset school staffing and start moving teachers around and all that kind of turmoil that we try to minimize through our 11-day count process. Hopefully, each day comes on and brings more information, but we're going to have to be a little fluid here and just make the best decisions we can on the information available at the time. You're bound to adopt a tentative budget July 29th, and we'll have multiple scenarios probably throughout this process and be ready with a list of alternatives, and then we'll have to see how far down the list do we have to go to basically get balanced. And anything we can do to save money, we're doing, and we're trying to, like as Ms. Canoe showed, we're trying to build that fund balance to give us a little cushion. We know we're going to have some cost associated with COVID-19 preparation, to make our schools safe for the students. And anyway, I think we're going to be having frequent. The superintendent I've been talking. We're probably, you're going to see a lot more of us, Ms. Canoes and I, because we're going to have frequent budget workshops throughout the summer, really, to do this work.
Dr. Fenoy, you want to comment, and then Ms. McQuinn?
Yes, just for the public to know and to remind the board members, I committed to bringing on more meetings. And so our wonderful support team, Carol Bass, should be reaching out to the board about seeking your availability to add, I think it's close to 5 meetings during the course of June and July. Because typically, as we all know, but the public needs to understand, the summer is typically a lull time for us. However, we are putting on the calendar at least, I think it was 5 additional meetings in order to bring you through all the different scenarios that we're working through, so that your input can be provided and that the community can hear our thought processes along the summer. So all of that will begin beginning in June.
Thank you, Dr. Fenoy. Mrs. McQuinn?
Thank you. I'm really going back to, you can see me looking through some notes to something that Dr. Robinson referenced and that I kind of mentioned at our last board meeting. But I have been doing some research into school boards' responsibilities in terms of responding during the pandemic. And one of the pieces that I think was very important, I'll share it's from a blog from Education Week. The gentleman's name is Rick Hess, talking about the fact that the pandemic itself, managing the pandemic, doesn't fall to the school board. That falls to first responders. And he gave an example. You certainly don't want hospital clerks running around and trying to administer cardiac units or something. But right now, the crisis falls to management, superintendent, principals, teachers, and they've been doing that very well. But the school board's responsibilities in terms of, first, the short term, that was, I know I'm going to hurry, Mr. Barbieri, but this really is important, is that we continue to ask the superintendent to keep us closely informed about the progress that the district is making toward, and started with distance learning. And there have been many board questions about that. How many kids are we missing, et cetera, in terms of tuning into the distance learning. So we have a responsibility to ask those questions. But another one that I think is very important, and it references long-term planning, and that this is the time as a board, in direction to the superintendent, is not to want to go back to the normal. It is to create a new normal, not to steal from Mr. Burke, but it is to create a new normal in terms of inequities that we know have existed in how we deliver instruction to kids. So I'll send this out to everyone, but it really is a very nice article from Education Week about school board responsibilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McQuinn. I just want you to know that the superintendent and I have had many discussions over the last week and a half, 2 weeks, about the need to have as many open meetings, not only for us to ask the questions and get information, but also so the public knows that we've given a lot of thought to all the different variables that might come to play here. And it doesn't look like we've just made a decision in a vacuum. So that's one of the reasons why the superintendent is setting up all these additional meetings for us. Any other board members have any questions? Thank you, Mr. Burke and Ms. Knust. Mr. Superintendent, you want to go to the next one?
Before I go to the next one, I need to read a statement, if that's okay with you, Mr. Chairman. We don't have a comprehensive picture of the financial impact of COVID-19 on our district for weeks, if not months. And the financial strain on our economy may stay with us for years. That said, we must remain true to our commitment to excellence in education for all students. Here are some of my personal guiding principles that I will rely on when we look at upcoming budgets. Victory will occur in our classrooms. The research is clear that effective teachers are the most important factor contributing to student achievement. Curriculum, funding, class size, and family and community support all contribute to student achievement. Nothing, however, is as important as the teacher. Every student deserves a great teacher. Palm Beach County has some of the best teachers in the state of Florida. This belief is reaffirmed for me every time I see my son interact with one of his great teachers. It is also evident to me when I virtually visited Robin Nogels from Elbridge Gale and Gabriela Martinez from Heritage and watched their outstanding literacy lessons. This is critically important for students who are already behind or students who are failing because of the changes that would have been necessitated by COVID-19. These students must be taught by teachers who can help them learn more than 1 year's worth of material during 1 year's time. This type of acceleration is the only way that these students will ever catch up. Classrooms and schools must be supported instructionally, operationally, and financially. Great teaching doesn't happen in a vacuum. However, even our best teachers need professional development and academic support to continually help them grow. They need clean classrooms, classroom supplies, beautiful schools, and of course, students who are brought to school safely, fed with care and affection, and scheduled into their classes. We may even need to re-examine how we are supporting the schools who serve our most fragile students. Are we systematically doing enough to support them? Or could we be looking at ways to strategically allocate resources based on need? Our district serves over 176,000 students. They deserve a continued investment in infrastructure, information technology, information and physical security, personnel, transportation, and other critical services. We are in an extraordinarily large and complex system that requires many, many components to function securely and at an optimal level. Finally, we are funded by the taxpayers and must be good stewards of the public's money. I take this responsibility very seriously. 80% of our budget supports salaries and benefits. If we need to cut 10% of our budget, it will affect personnel, as we can't cut 50% of everything else. For these reasons and many more, we must be deliberate and steadfast in our demands for an additional emergency funding from the state and federal governments. And we must continue to be diligent and conservative with our spending. And at this time, I'd like to turn the workshops over to Deputy Superintendent Keith Oswald, who will bring forward with our CAO, Glenda Sheffield, some of virtual learning options to the board. Thank you.